All right, are we good to go? Welcome everybody, thanks for coming along. Compliant Mac workloads in the cloud.
I'm Dave Siederer.
I'm Marcus Ransom. I'm from Jamf.
And I'm from AWS. We're labeled.
We're going to show you how. So, we're going to talk about what is a cloud Mac. You've probably heard lots of things. You may have even heard Dave talk about this. And then look at how are they different to the other Macs that we've got in our environment. And then we're going to look at compliance. Why are we getting these machines out from under the cupboards that the developers have, and what do we need to do to ensure that they're a good machine, keeping our organisation safe. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to put it all together and understand how we can make this into something that works. So Dave, tell us about Cloud Macs. What is a Cloud Mac?
Well, it's the Cloud Mac. I do want to start a little bit at the beginning, because the Cloud Mac was created originally for a very specific purpose, and that was around the app development lifecycle. For folks that have made apps for iOS, macOS, anything that needs a signature, that designing, developing, coding, like this stuff can be done on kind of any platform that you can think of. But the really crucial, the build, the test, the sign, the publish needs Xcode. And Xcode only runs on macOS, and macOS only runs on Apple hardware. So in order to get access to all of these wonderful operating systems to develop for, it is important to have that Apple hardware.
And I guess this is why we saw all of the developers having a whole bunch of Mac Minis or other things sort of secreted away in various parts of their offices, which would often scare security teams, compliance teams. So what was the solution to this?
Well, this is the nice thing. This shot is not my junk drawer, although it kind of does look like it. These wires are actually connected to things. What you see here is a Mac Mini. We also do have Mac Studio hardware as well. And this is plugged into what's called AWS Nitro. That is that green card down there, and that is providing storage and networking over Thunderbolt. So that's going to give you not only speed, but the flexibility in doing things like expanding your storage as needed. And of course, this is entirely automated. So there's not a human being that you have to send out to the data center to do something about this. There's actually in that black box on the right there, a robot finger that takes care of any of the firmware update or power pushing that things need.
Yeah.
So yeah, here's an overview. We actually do still have we have x86 instances available, and a whole lot of Apple Silicon, M2, M1, M2 Pro, and M1 Ultra in case you need a whole lot of RAM.
So Jamf and AWS have been working together on a bunch of things to try and make life easy for our shared customers. So things like automation around AWS verified access, but also when the EC2 Macs first came out. So it was really awesome to see at the Jamf Nation User Conference, your Vice President talking about the EC2 Macs and how Jamf was the first integrated enrollment for these from a device management point of view.
Yeah, it's definitely incredibly exciting, especially with things like AWS verified access.
Yeah. So, being able to use the information in Jamf that we have on the status of devices to be able to make decisions and control how you can access various AWS services, what you have access to, what you don't have access to, based on the status of your device. So let's talk around use cases of what we might use these Cloud Macs for. So, we spoke about Xcode. So what are some of the other things that we might see people using these Cloud Macs for?
Yeah, we definitely see a lot of development, but we also see a lot of testing. Folks that need access to a Mac either for short term, or just need access to something that they can test and retest and erase as much as they want without having to kind of worry, is this hardware going to be degraded? And even to be able to test on more than one version of macOS, for example.
And so we've also heard a few different sessions here at Macaduck about virtualization. So we can also use the Cloud Mac as a VM host to be able to virtualize and use some of the awesome tools that we've got there. Because it's really just a Mac that's somewhere else, isn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of the cool thing about it, is you have access to the bare metal. You're not running a VM on top of it. You can run your VMs on top of it. You can run your containers, things like Mac Stadium, Orca. Those absolutely run on EC2 Mac.
So it really is just taking those Macs out from the cupboard in the developer's room and putting them somewhere where we know where they are, we can see them, and we can, most importantly, manage them. So what we might do is we might talk about two sort of different use cases out of the many possibilities there are. And we can use these different use cases to frame how we may want to approach compliance. So the first one is sort of the build server that you spoke to there earlier. Running things like Xcode, build kite, the sort of thing that is probably going to be accessed via SSH. So that developers don't like a GUI; they like going in through the command line, which is really serves the purpose of this machine here. And it's something that's probably regularly re-provisioned. It's being used for a build process, and then it would be deprovisioned and then re-provisioned again. We may have multiples of them when there's a lot of building to be done to sort of rapidly spin up and bring them down again. But then there's another use case we might talk to, which is, you mentioned before, a testing machine. So this is something where you may be testing applications, going through QA, having a look at how they operate, having a look at how packages are working, how you can manipulate them, looking at different workflows that we might be building as a Mac admin and seeing how they operate. So this is something where you're likely to be logging in via the GUI, maybe using something like Jamf Connect. You may be wanting to operate as an administrator on the machine, but you may want to be able to use different operating systems on this to be able to test how these applications and workflows manifest in different versions of Mac OS. So we can think of these sort of two different use cases as we're going through compliance. So now we've spoken about how they are really just the same as the Mac Mini we have in the cupboard. How are they different?
Don't worry, not too much. Yeah. So to start with, enrollment is something that's very much, when it comes to automated device enrollment, hardware is fairly crucial to that. This is hardware, but this is hardware that is not owned by, it's owned by us. So the hardware itself, the serial numbers, aren't able to be put through ADE. That absolutely does not mean you can't enroll these. These are very much enrollable through user-initiated enrollment, UIE. We're actually going to show some automation of that a little bit later on, including the actual setup process for it too.
So where we can't do automated device enrollment, the way these are built gives us some really cool things that we can do. So we mentioned before the different operating systems that you may want to test. So you can actually re-provision these really quickly onto different versions of the operating system. So I think, we love erase all content and settings for our bare metal Macs, but that's the same operating system we return to. So as well as changing the operating systems, we can also do some other things with them, can't we?
Yeah, and I want to mention too, when it comes to changing the operating systems and more, imaging. Yeah, really. Imaging is it's not back for everyone, but very much in the cloud. Imaging is a thing, and the neat thing is you kind of get to use a lot of the strengths that you've had before. The idea that what you can do is take, in the case of a build server, for example, those developers, they have dependencies, they have needs, they want to make sure that there's a certain version of Xcode, a certain version of any of the command line utilities that they're running. So to be able to not only say, okay, we have that, say, saved in a configuration, but also have that saved bit for bit and ready to roll whenever they need it.
So accessing these machines is a little bit different from machines that we have sitting in front of us because we can't type on them, we can't use Touch ID, things like that, but it's also, we can't look at them. So we need to think about how we're going to access these machines. So what sort of different options are customers using for accessing these cloud Macs?
So out of the box, there is support for an SSH key. It is actually a system built first for the admin does not have a password out of the box, so it's not possible to actually get into the GUI without setting something separately. Otherwise, you need to connect with an SSH key or something like Amazon EC2 Instance Connect, where you can actually connect a little bit separate of the network itself.
So when we spoke about our build server, that's primarily SSH that's going to be used, but when we're looking at test servers, that's going to be something where it depends on what you're using it for. That's where you're more likely to be using a GUI for interacting with that.
Yeah.
So device management, that's another area where things are a little bit different. So what are some of the things we need to be mindful of when we're looking at device management on these devices?
So I'd mentioned earlier that what we're getting is user-approved MDM. So it is a supervised device, and you will be able to basically do everything that you were able to do on something else that was that had been registered with a profile. There are some architectural differences, though. The biggest one is file vault. And that sounds scary, but I promise that I'm not telling you that you don't need encryption for your data. The way that an EC2 Mac works, all those wires that are plugged in, the boot drive is actually not used for regular usage. It's more for, it's literally there for firmware and in order to boot the external volume, which is actually the AWS Nitro. And that is actually something that is, it can be encrypted and can be encrypted by default. It can be encrypted so that you cannot turn off the encryption. And that encryption is also AES 256. So that's the same standard that Apple basically has for the key on File Vault.
So the way we use these also has a couple of other differences as well. So what's something we need to be mindful of in terms of usage of these machines?
So as an engineer who loves a challenge also, this was actually interesting because we do have a system extension. And that system extension specifically is for the network to come in. And system extensions, a system extension allowance profile would need our either our developer ID or the developer ID and the identifier on that. We've got that up on our GitHub as well.
So let's talk software license agreements.
Isn't that the most fun?
Yes, exactly. So who here has read the software license agreement for Mac OS? A couple of people, yeah.
I'm still impressed. It's zero so often.
Yeah. So we need to be aware of the requirements of these from the software licensing agreement because we don't want to have our organisations be breaching those. So 24-hour minimum on demand and then a maximum of 2 VMs running on the host at any time. And then the permitted developer services. Do you want to run through what that looks like?
Yeah, because a lot of that comes down to sort of what is a Cloud Mac best for, and sometimes what is it not best for. Really, again, we built this first for developers. That very much is not the only application that it's available for, and really can get things moving nicely. But let's say to look at something like a graphics workstation. May not be the right thing to do based on the licensing. Neither of us are lawyers, so we're not here to interpret that. But there are definitely different.
Making sure you're building these machines so they're fit for purpose. So if this is going to be someone's primary workstation, is this going to be a good experience for them? Are they going to be productive, given the way these devices work? So now let's get to what we're talking about, which is compliance. So why are we doing this? Why is the reason that security doesn't like us having a bunch of Mac Minis sitting in a broom cupboard somewhere? It's not just about having oversight and control of those machines. It's about being able to prove that those machines are being used how the owners say they're going to be used. The developers say, we have a use case, we need this machine, making sure that that's exactly what it's being used for. It's often very tempting to realise that you can start using those machines for other things. Next minute you might have a media streaming server running on it because everybody likes to get access to things. We don't want that to be happening. More importantly, to be able to verify that that isn't actually what's happening, that our developers are following the rules and they're using these tools for things that they're designed for, and so the security team can be confident about that. And it also allows us to be confident that they haven't been compromised. So it's about trust but verify. We trust our colleagues to use these tools the way they're designed to be used, but we also need that verification in there. So if anybody's familiar working with compliance benchmarks and audits, just saying that you're doing something is not enough. You need some artifacts to show that this is in fact what's happening. So at Jamf, we have a way of looking at things that Rochelle showed us before with documentation, but we're talking about trusted access on devices, only authorized users on enrolled devices that are secure and compliant can access sensitive data. And that's not just something you apply to the end user workstations, it's something we can apply to all sorts of services that we have as well. It's not a product we sell, it's a way we look at things, and then we apply a combination of products and practices and ways of doing things to ensure that we're compliant. So, if we have a look at this diagram that we've got there, we enroll a device so we can get that control. We want to use automation so we don't leave it up to the user to ensure that these machines are set up the way that they want. We've got to make sure that they're secure. We want to make sure that we're preventing any threats. We want to know who's using the device and make sure that it's the right person using the device, and then control what it can access. When we start looking at compliance in terms of certifications, Cyber Essentials, something that you all are probably very familiar with here, it's not just the actual developer workstations, it's everything in the pipeline. So Cyber Essentials says, do you trust the devices on which code is being written? You also need to make sure you trust the devices that any of your code is being passed through to make sure that things aren't happening to your code while it's going through all these build pipelines. There are various benchmarks that we can use to establish the right configurations and settings on these. So whether we're talking, CIS benchmarks, which is something that's very widely used, or whether for compliance reasons you may have to comply with something from NIST or DISA. So these are best practices for the configuration of these devices. These are a starting point for building a secure framework. So we're going to look at CIS benchmarks for the purpose of this here. macOS Security Compliance Project is an awesome community tool run out of NIST, but a lot of organizations contributing to it, including Jamf, turning those benchmarks into code with consensus from a lot of Mac admins to make sure that we know the right way to enforce this and audit this on our workstations. So Jamf provided the Jamf compliance editor in a GUI that makes it really easy for you to implement that, and more recently we've actually brought that into the Jamf console. So it's really easy for you to configure and deploy and monitor these compliance benchmarks right from within the Jamf console across all the devices that you're managing. Keep an eye on this as it evolves. There's a lot more functionality coming through. But it's really important to understand the difference between these benchmarks, what we see in those in the documentation and all of the options that you have, and then a baseline. So if you just implemented the full CIS level 2 onto your machines, your users aren't going to like you, and you're probably not going to be secure because they will just find another machine to work on that they can do their job. So this is where you need to configure your baselines for your organization. So that's looking through that benchmark and assessing which one of these rules apply to us, which one of these rules apply to the way these machines are being used. And you're probably not just going to have one baseline. You're probably going to have a couple of them. You may have some developers that need very specific access. You may have knowledge workers that are going to, not need as many exemptions from the rules. But you may also have some of these cloud Macs where a lot of these configurations and settings in there do not apply to the sort of hardware and how they're being accessed. So what are some of the rules that we'd see in CIS Level 2 that we might not want to apply to these machines, even if we are applying them to the end user workstations?
Yeah, a great example, of course, we were mentioning earlier SSH connection. This is a lot of the time the first connection that someone's making to make any changes to this image. So typically we'd want to make sure that that access is on.
Some of the other things, you mentioned file vault before, but there are other things that don't exist on these machines. So for example, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth aren't on the machines. They've been removed. so you don't need to configure those on the machines. Operating system updates. If you're controlling specific versions of the operating system relating to what you're testing or what you're building, you probably don't want macOS deciding to update during the middle of a software build or a software test or anything like that. So this is where you would make the decision in the baseline for these devices not to have those settings managed. Secrets. There's a lot of really important things happening on these devices. So we need to be very deliberate about how those secrets are being used to make sure we're not exposing critical information that can be compromised. And that compromise might not be, a nation-state threat actor. It might be something where the developer or a user is having to interact with those secrets to get them working on the device, and so they may then end up leaving that secret in a text file on their desktop to make it easier. So there's better ways of us managing these, aren't there?
Yeah, and honestly, I think we've all been guilty at one point or another of going, oh, that credential should not be in TextEdit.
Yeah.
And yeah, AWS offers a few different services. I'm going to highlight AWS Secrets Manager specifically because this is something that encrypts with that same encryption key that you'd be working with for the Elastic Block Store, the EBS, that boot volume. In addition to that, it uses the granular permissions that AWS uses for everything else. To me, one of the big advantages of EC2 is that an EC2 Mac is an AWS object, like anything else. So that also means that it can get what's called an instance profile. And that means you can tell it what it's able to access. And in the case that we're going to be looking at in a little bit, what it's able to access is going to be basically 5 pieces of text, but those are going to be only able to be accessed specifically because I gave this permission to that Mac. Otherwise, nothing.
Something else you need to consider as well with secrets is any of the developer certificates that are going to be on that device, whether they're used for signing applications, signing packages, notarization, those sorts of things. Those certificates are really the key to your organization. That's your trust between yourself and Apple. So you want to make sure that those certificates are deployed onto these devices in a very deliberate and considered way that manages those secrets. So we've looked at how we configure these devices. How do we verify that these devices are in fact being used the way that they are? The configuration is really a point in time where we push that configuration down the machine and stop things from happening. But AWS also has some other features that allow us to look at what's going on those machines. So what are some of the things we can use to add to that audit trail of how these devices are being used?
So the 2 big ones I'd want to highlight right here, AWS CloudWatch first, which is available to, able to basically take in, I don't want to say any metric, but there's quite a few different ones, from something as simple as CPU or RAM pressure, or even drive space that's being used. If you really felt like it, you could make a program that says once this text file has 30 Ys in it, then it's time to do something about that.
And something that we've got from Jamf as well, which is really useful as well, is our telemetry. In Jamf Protect, but part of the Jamf for Mac offering as well. So the benefit of telemetry that we have compared to inventory. Inventory, once again, is a snapshot of a point in time, information we know about the device from when the inventory was run. And that's really useful information, but telemetry is an incredibly rich live stream of data as to what's happening on that device that you can output into your SIEM using Apple's endpoint security APIs, and gives you the full spectrum of information that's happening on there. So this is something where the security team can use that information to be really confident that these machines are only being used for what they were designed for. There's also some other really cool things in there in terms of parametric logs as well. So you can actually also use the information you're getting here to understand the performance of the things that you're doing, the applications you're testing, whether the hardware that you're working on is the right hardware or whether you need to move up to something bigger. Identity. Who's using it? How are they using it? So you mentioned the SSH access and how we can manage that. What are some of the other things that we can do here?
Well, since these are Macs themselves, this is something that's going to work just perfectly well with Platform SSO, with something like Jamf Connect.
We could even potentially bind them to AD. Might not be the right idea.
If one wanted to, then...
But we can also control where that access is coming from, both from the network, but also the devices that the users are accessing these from. So this is something where you can use some tools like AWS Verify to say, all right, you do need to authenticate as a particular user, a particular SSH key to get in, but we're only going to allow you to do that from places where it's trusted and that we know that it is in fact you on that device. AWS has got a bunch of networking tools that we can use for dealing with this as well.
Of course we do. I hope we do. So above all, I'd mention again this an EC2 Mac is, if you've used any of the AWS EC2 instances before for Linux or Windows, it's going to be very familiar. The biggest difference, of course, is just that it's a dedicated host because we need a physical Mac, but otherwise it is in your virtual private cloud, your AWS VPC. It's able to connect to not only the resources that it can network-wise, but it also has that identity and access management, that ability to say, slap a profile on here and you're able to read something.
Yeah, controlling not just what can access the host, but also what the host can access. So the ability to really lock these down to just the required hosts. So from a security and compliance point of view, you're giving it the least privileged access. So we've considered all of these things that we want to do on these devices. How do we put this together? What does this look like?
So this is a bit of the architecture behind my what's called Enroll EC2 Mac, which will have a QR code at the end with some links.
Yeah. So originally when this was launched, it was just a binary managing, which you mentioned before with network extensions, system extensions, all of the things we may need for compliance. We really need MDM. So how has AWS managed to get us to achieve that, to have the MDM enrollment without being able to use automated device enrollment?
So yeah, well, we're going to take a look at the architecture and actually see it in action. So first, we're starting with our EC2 instance that's got that script running. That's going to go out and, again, check when it has the right instance profile, it's going to be able to get that secret, which has, in this case, it's got credentials for the instance itself, and it has credentials to operate the Jamf API. So going back to the script, the next thing that happens is it actually will reach back out over the VPC to a Jamf server with that API credential and ask for create invitation. So it gets an invitation code.
Yeah. So it gets enrolled in your Jamf instance, and so from then on, it's pretty much like we said, just like a normal Mac.
Yeah.
However, we know that user-initiated enrollment on a Mac is exactly what it says. It's user-initiated, but we don't really want to rely on the user to do these things because we want to make sure that this device is compliant and this has actually happened. So how do we go about making sure that we don't have to get the developers to go through that process every time they want to enroll these machines?
So yeah, what we're going to see next is actually going to be basically the whole process. The other thing that I've done here is I used a template that I've got up on the repo as well to put those credentials in. I have my Jamf API keys, and I've got the credentials for my local user here to get set up. So what's happening is first I'm actually going to go into terminal. This is actually downloading the script itself and running a setup flag. That setup flag is basically just a quick prompt for, in this case, accessibility privileges and the ability to operate system events to system settings. Once this is set up, and this is basically a one-time setup for the image. So right now what you're seeing, my hands are on this and they're doing things. And let's see, I'm gonna set up accessibility access right here. But of course, anyone, it's not exactly a challenge to manually go in and enroll something. So this right here, it's gonna go through one more check and make sure it's got all the privileges it needs. And if I were doing this in production, I would click the OK button here and create an image. Instead of doing that, though, because this is basically just so you can see this, I'm going to log out and then log back in, which is basically if I restarted, it would give us the same result, but we wouldn't get to see it. So this is probably a better way to see it. So once I'm logging out here and logging back in, hands are free. Nothing up my sleeve, nothing touching the keyboard. This is something that would be done without the user interacting, without the user having to worry about that. And all that setup is that one time. So this, when you launch your Mac, this is happening. This is happening automatically. It goes through the enrollment, it's verifying, it's understanding really where it is on the, in the UI itself, and then verifying that the enrollment actually completed. So I actually popped back in here just to scroll down and see all the profiles that have come in.
So effectively, when a developer goes to spin one of these up, probably using automation as well, all of this stuff is happening in the background. And so then they're generally just waiting to get that notification that this machine is up and ready. And by that time, it's already enrolled in Jamf. All of the compliance, profiles, scripts, management, everything like that is automatically installed on the machine, and then they're able to use it for what they need to do. So if it's the test Mac, they can go and log into that machine and do the testing that they need to do. The machine's running the operating system they need. The controls are applied to that operating system based on policies that you've put in Jamf, and they can do what they need to do. If it's the CI/CD developer build machine, they SSH in. Once again, that's probably automated as well, and it just goes through the testing. The data is getting sent to the security team to say this machine spun up for this amount of time. We didn't trigger any alerts saying it did any of the things it wasn't supposed to do, and everyone can be confident and happy that this is happening in a secure way. So it's really important to design the workflows for how you're going to secure these devices and make sure they're compliant to match the use cases. You need to approach these differently to the way you would look at compliance for your user workstations, and also understand what they're going to be used for, how to get it in a way that people can actually do their work properly.
That's exactly it. It's just very important to, as we all do, I think everyone in this room considers your users. It's considering your cloud as well is not really going to be too much of a stretch.
Yep. So we do have some resources here as well. So if you want to find out about how to do this in your environment, I found especially the Getting Started with EC2. There's some great video walkthroughs there, the scripts, everything you need to be able to get this working with your device management tools in there as well. And also a link, a shout out to the macOS Security Compliance Project there as well. It's a really amazing resource to be able to streamline that compliance. You know, if everybody remembers back, 3 or 4 years ago, if somebody came to you and said, we want to implement CIS Level 2, that was going to be a lot of time to put that together. Now it's really straightforward. So with that, does anybody have any questions? I think, we do, down there.
So you mentioned that there's a bunch of things that, talking about the macOS Security Compliance Project, there are things that you shouldn't apply to like an EC2 Mac. Is there a list of what you shouldn't do that you could then hand off to your security folks to say, here's the official guidance from AWS that says, here's the things to skip?
I don't think we have an official document at this time, but that's something that I'm just going to say I want to do it. So.
Yeah, because I think it's going to often come down to the list may include it depends, because it's also going to depend on how these devices are being used. So some of those are ensuring things are shown in the GUI. We need to make sure Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are shown in the GUI. If nobody's logging into it, are those required? But I think, it's a great idea showing the specific hardware requirements. It's also going to depend on which benchmark and which baseline you're applying, but no, that's a great idea.
Yeah, we do.
It's just that it's one of those things when you have an auditor come through, the auditor loves the checklist and it is not really interested in anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I'd say checklists are definitely something that we've seen a lot of, when it comes to security folks.
Yeah.
They do want to make sure that things are kind of taken care of there. Yeah.
Seeing it written down somewhere, even if maybe, as you might find, Rich, that the person who wrote it down on the website might actually be yourself, the auditors like that.
Yeah. And we do have some information on. I'd mentioned the system extension and File Vault. Some of that is available on GitHub today too.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.